welcome everybody. I think in life sometimes people come into your life often briefly and leave a huge impact, and our guest today, Dr. Paul Wood, is one of those people for me. I often think of him, often think of his circumstances, and I often think about the small meeting we had, but the big impact. I'll tell you something secret. When I was in my personal mental health hell, one of the things my brain used to get, one of my anxieties was I was going to do something and end up in prison, and not being able to get out. And while that might sound funny, it was a real fear of mine, and it used to take me to bed sometimes shaking. Our guest today, Dr. Paul Wood, if you haven't, read his book, How to Escape from Prison. It was an incredibly inspiring book for me. And also his second book, Mental Fitness, is something that you should just read. You're going to get so many great things out of it. So real pleasure to have you online again, Paul. We did this a few years ago, but today we're talking about boundaries. So welcome, mate. What have you been up to?
Kia ora, JK. Again, you look just stoked to have the chance to be yarning with you. Well, as you mentioned, I've published that second book, but also as well, I've just been making an effort to ensure I don't miss the early years of my kids' lives. Like my boys are 5 and 8 now. And I heard this great quote the other day about young kids, particularly babies, and that's, long nights, short years. And I thought that's so true, eh? And so what I've been doing is doing a lot more of that, savoring this time, because when they're a bit older, they're going to want less cuddles and all of that stuff. So that's actually been a big focus for me over the last sort of year and a half or so.
Yeah. So just to give you a little bit of a brief background about Dr. Paul. Had a bit of a misfortune in his life, and I'll let him explain it if he wants, but you should read his book once again. But spent time in prison and has completely turned his life around. And when I met him, it was this amazing program, that we did together, and Dr. Paul came to present, and it was life-changing for a lot of the young men in that room that could have been taking the wrong pathway. But today's about boundaries, mate. And often when I'm in a place, sometimes I need to have mental boundaries that I put on myself. I might be in public, but I've got these mental boundaries where I either give or don't give, or I'm just looking after me mentally on a certain day. But how did you deal with boundaries in prison when I can't even imagine to think what it's like.
Yeah, look, it's interesting. And just to give people, but for the people who don't know me, so you mentioned misfortune. I sort of don't see it that way, in the sense that, geez, I made every choice that put myself into the situation that earned me my place in the New Zealand prison system long term. I made every choice to put myself there. And so I kind of don't see it as misfortune, in the sense that I don't see it as having been driven by anything that was outside of my control or responsibility, if that makes sense. I see it as a collection of choices that I was making that were really driven by placing value on the wrong things and not having a realistic understanding of myself or life. By the time I was into my teenage years, I was into drugs and alcohol, criminal activity, nothing that was unusual in my area. And then I just continued making choices that were about not having to deal with reality, and not having a realistic understanding of what emotions were completely normal for me to be experiencing, and therefore thinking there was something wrong with me when I felt all these ones that made me feel vulnerable and weak. And I ended up catching up with a drug dealer when I was 18, and I unnecessarily took their life. I was convicted of murder. And I hate saying that word, JK, because it's a heavy word, but it is the reality. And I was in prison from 18 to 29, including spending some time in New Zealand's toughest maximum security prison in Peremarimu and B Block there, which was the most violent and predatory gang block at the time. And I spent nearly a year up there when I turned 20. So yeah, it was a pretty hard environment. And boundaries, geez. Boundaries became absolutely crucial for my survival, but also for my ability to start to change my life when I was ready to do so. You know, one of the things I learned in prison pretty early on, and that was this, the more people you were associated with, the greater your risk of attack due to being contaminated from other people's politics. So you were talking about like boundaries in terms of, you know, your mental boundaries, but there literally had to be boundaries around associations in there. Because if this guy comes up and starts talking to me, and then I start being friendly with him, and then someone's got something against him, this is how it works in prison, is when someone's going to attack someone else, the first thing they tend to look at is, who does that person associate with? So who do I have to potentially worry about backing him up or supporting him if a battle ensues? And so when you associate with people, you don't know what they bring to the table in terms of the vendettas that they might be about to experience or anything like that. And so you can potentially end up being attacked preemptively because someone thinks that they need to worry about you supporting someone else. So you literally have to have massive boundaries around your relationships. And as I started making change in my life, even more so I had to have boundaries around activities and other things and associations that might actually bring me into situations where it was harder to make choices that were about what was in the best interest of my future self, the person I wanted to become, rather than just, you know, playing out the same old dramas inside.
That's really interesting, because I think that when you, does it become lonely because you can't trust anyone? And then how did you put boundaries around your trust? Because I think, you know, I've got a philosophy in life. I'd rather be, trustworthy and let down than not, but my life's never depended on it. Right. So
yeah. And look, it's a funny one, because to be honest with you, naturally, I'm quite a credulous, trusting person. Like, my wife shakes her head at me sometimes in terms of, you know, just how much I give people the benefit of the doubt, because I very much believe what you believe there. Hey, look, it's better to trust and be let down occasionally than it is to just, you know, wall off yourself against the world and have a more suspicious mentality. However, I'll tell you this right now, you know, when you're in a situation like prison, the consequences really do outweigh those natural tendencies and preferences. And you do learn that it really is a matter of physical survival and well-being to be quite conscious and suspicious. You know, it's like that, they say, don't look a gift horse in the mouth, right? Well, that might be true in general life, but in prison, you want to look it in the mouth and check behind the tail, because people don't tend to engage in things which are just as they appear on the surface. Often there'll be many steps involved in terms of planning attacks on people and all sorts of stuff that I personally witnessed so many times, that you do have to be super guarded and suspicious. For example, I witnessed when I was very early into my sentence, some guys who I knew who spent months cultivating a friendship with someone just so they could get them into an area of the prison where there weren't cameras and attack them. You just have to be so careful about the motives of people in that context, in a way which just doesn't generally apply in everyday life. So again, I'm like you naturally, but boy, when you find yourself in a situation like prison, you learn pretty quickly that you just have to try and survive according to the, you know, the terrain you're in rather than what you might prefer. And the consequences are so extreme that you just can't take those same risks, JK.
I think what really intrigues me, and this is something that we all have trouble with, like when we've done a couple of these boundary sessions, it's really cool because, you know, if I just talk to you about my little simple one, the University of No, right? So I struggle to say no to people because I actually really care about the subject. I really want to help, right? Sometimes to the detriment of myself. So one of the boundaries I need to do is understand that. But what I was really interested about your story is, and hey, listen, if anyone wants to answer any questions, just chuck it in the chat, chuck it in the Q&A, and we'll sort it, and I'll ask whatever you want. So let's think about, you had no boundaries, right? You spoke about your drug and your alcohol and all that sort of stuff, and it sounds like it was motivated from, you know, a pretty deep psychological thing about being tough or whatever it is. You might want to go into that later, but how did you actually start mentally having boundaries. If you were in one part of your life and now you're in this incredibly good space in your life, what was that flick? Because I always remember in your book, you know, the first few years you carried on as being the old Paul, right? And then there was this moment. So how did you actually go, I'm going to set these boundaries for myself mentally, and then translate that into the life that you were in?
Yeah, look, I think it wasn't like a Damascene experience where I just saw the light and then radically transformed everything. But I did definitely have a moment where I realized I could have a different future. I could have a better future, but it would require me to live in a different way and make different choices. And basically, you know, when I had decided I wanted to start studying, it wasn't driven by any intent of doing a degree or anything. I would have thought that was way beyond me in terms of my expectations of myself educationally. I'd never done well at school. I'd been held back a year at school, that sort of stuff. And I completed these 2 papers in psychology. And through that first year of study, I realized that I wasn't actually dumb. I had just never exercised my brain, and I had never been studying something I was genuinely interested in. And I know that people tuning in will have had the personal experience about trying to learn something they are interested in versus something they're not, and how different that is. This was my first experience of really studying and learning something I was interested in. And I ended up passing these first 2 papers. And I remember I got those passes, which blew my mind. It was way beyond what I expected I was capable of succeeding at university level. But I got these passes when I was in a punishment block. And I was in this punishment block for drug use. What they used to do is they used to put people who were caught 3 times for drug-related offending, either from urine tests or paraphernalia or anything. They would put them all together in a punishment block at a separate prison. And I was there, and I was around lots of people who were making the same choices as I was, you know, who were choosing to not deal with the reality of their lives and situations through escapism and drug use. And I could see lots of people who represented what my future would look like if I carried on that same path. But then I passed these papers and I thought, I could carry on with this. I could actually have something that I'm proud of come out of this terrible experience that would give me a radically different experience upon release, different life. And so that's when those boundaries started to come into play. And to be honest with you, a lot of it was experimentation, right? And what I mean by this is going, okay, well, I can't carry on using drugs like I have been and succeed in study. And so what I'll do is, you know, I'll stop doing drugs to the same extent, and then realizing that actually that didn't work for me. I needed to completely stop doing drugs. And then realizing that it wasn't enough for me to just decide I'd stop doing drugs. I needed to stop being around people and associating with people who would give me the option of drug use. And so I needed to remove myself. But these were all lessons learned along the way, JK. And I think that's an important idea. It's not often that you know exactly what your boundaries need to be ahead of time. A lot of the time, you only figure this out through failure, through challenge, through a lack of success, where you go, hey, something's going on here I don't like. I need to experiment with putting in place a boundary. And then as I go on further, I realize I need a few more of these. And I mean, you know, you saying no is a classic one I relate to, and I think most people do. What I used to do, JK, there, and this was, you know, the progression of discovering how to do boundaries properly, is I used to just say, oh, not now, but maybe in the future. But all I was really doing was creating a boundary for today, but creating a debt of time and debt of needing to go back and revisit something again in the future. So as a result of learning that, I've gotten much better at just going, no, I'm not going to have the bandwidth to do this now, and I won't be able to prioritize this, but I really appreciate you being interested in involving me and wanting to engage me with this. And so what I'm doing is I'm now not putting off for the future something I'm saying no to today. My boundaries are clearer, but that's only been learned through trial and error, right? And it was the same in prison. And I just learned that actually I needed to isolate myself further and further from people who would even give me the opportunity to engage in drug use, who would even risk, you know, involving me in any of the politics that were going on in the prison system in terms of gang rivalries or anything else. And so you mentioned a word before that really hits with me, and that was lonely. It did end up being an incredibly lonely environment for me. because I was making these choices to put up more and more boundaries that were in the interest of my future self when I was released, but meant that my current self right now, had quite a lonely experience through isolation from other people.
Yeah, that really intrigued me as well. I was thinking about it this morning, right? So, and I think lesson number one for me is sometimes I'm really black and white and I just want to sort shit and, get some boundaries and then implement it. So thank you for that, because I think you can learn as you go. But the other thing I thought about is, and the reason why I spoke to you about mental boundaries was I don't presume, and I've never been to prison, that they're going to go, oh, good on you, Paul. Now we're going to help you with your boundaries. So, pretty much going out of your cell, you're going to congregational places. You might get a new cellmate that's just an absolute druggie. So how did you actually achieve that? Was that your own boundary cell in your own head? How did you actually do that? I mean,
yeah.
And how do you translate that now into the free world?
It's interesting, because there are some real parallels there, actually. And I think this is an interesting one. Look, you're right. There are some people who resented what I was doing. There were some inmates who thought, oh, this guy thinks he's better than us, because he's studying and he doesn't want to hang out and he doesn't want to gamble or do other things that were going on in the prison environment. And by the way, there were also staff members like that as well, right? Who resented that and who thought I shouldn't have been allowed to study in the prison system. But interestingly enough, there were also a number of inmates, and these were actually often the people who were the kingpins, the shot callers, the more senior gang members, who actually really supported and encouraged me in terms of my study. Because often the people who would end up in those positions were the people who were more capable, who had a greater degree of insight and intellect, and unfortunately that had enabled them to rise to higher positions of authority and influence and impact within a gang culture, whereas had they been born into a different environment, a different family, different circumstances, they could have easily ended up as senior leaders in organizations. But often those people would look at what I was doing and be really supportive of it, and there would be some guards as well who would be really supportive of it. And so it was a mixed bag there. And it was just about making sure that I was aware of the optics and managing the risk factors and impression around the people who were more resentful of what I was doing. But this also brings to mind for me, one of the clear boundaries I have in my life now, and that is who I choose to associate with. I only choose to associate with people who want the best for me and who are inspired by what I do and supportive of what I do, and who in turn I like to support and feel inspired by. Because I love that quote, right? Like, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. So when I was in the prison environment, I couldn't literally choose to physically be around only people who were supportive. Whereas now in my life, I really can. And here's a key one as well that I learned in prison in terms of the boundaries in which I've carried over, and I think is useful for all of us to know, and that is history isn't destiny in terms of our relationships. A lot of us will hold on to historical relationships and ways of being that really don't serve us well now and going forward. And I think that's one of the clear things around boundaries that a lot of us have to discover, and that is, what are those friendships we may have outgrown where the people who we're associating with, it's for historical reasons rather than because they actually encourage us and support us on our journey and really, want to celebrate our success rather than feel resentful or tear us down. But also we can get family members like this, right? Where perhaps you can't cut them off completely, but you have to learn through experience that boundaries will be important to be able to maintain a healthy relationship. Because sometimes family members, in-laws, and other people who you will have in your life, are people where you can't extend the same type of interaction and trust and engagement with them as you can to other people who you choose to have in your life. So that was one of the big things which is translated over for me, JK, if that makes sense.
Oh, that totally makes sense. And there's a really neat question here from Kirsty. As a working mum, I find it very challenging setting boundaries at work to allow me to have family time. How do you make internal change so that you accept the fact you're going to let people down, by setting and sticking to boundaries without feeling like you're failing.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's an important one, is looking at what your mindset is around that stuff, how you perceive again failure, what you think failure is, but also as well, you keep this in mind that, I mean, like, for example, one of the most common deathbed regrets, right, is I wish I hadn't worked as much. There are very few of us who are going to end up regretting spending too much time with our families and the people we love and care about in our personal lives. But lots of people do end up looking back and regretting how much time they spend at work. Now, I'm not saying that to discourage people from working, but what I am saying is that when you have to prioritize who you're going to let down, you want to make sure that you are prioritizing not letting down the people who are going to matter most to you in terms of your overall life journey, your overall life meaning and satisfaction. And the reality is that, you know, you can't be all things to all people and please everyone all the time. And therefore, you know, getting comfortable with that idea that, hey, saying no to additional work here, having boundaries here, is what enables me to not let down and fail the people who actually matter most to me. And being able to recognize that that's the trade-off. So that's an important one.
Yeah, look, I think if I would just add mine, I think that one of the things that excites me the most about the new world that we live in is that I think we've left our authentic self at home, probably for the last 150 years of work. And particularly during COVID, then post-COVID, I think you're allowed to bring your authentic self a bit more. And I think what Paul said to me before, you know, sometimes I get caught up in my own head, right? But with my workmates, I sit down and tell them my priorities, right? You would have heard the saying, leave loudly, you know, bosses that leave loudly and say, I'm going to watch my kids play football, you know, they become some of the great leaders. But if you haven't taken your whole authentic self to work, then sit down and have that conversation and tell them your priorities and work out the happy balance, because I have a guilt shark, right? So if I walk out of the office and I'm going to do this after this, I'm going to drive to the beach and my wife's already down there, to get rid of the guilt, I've got to explain that and be a bit more authentic about it, right?
Yeah.
So I would also, you know, I think Paul's completely right, but then I call it starting again. You can sit down with the people at work and say, look, here's my priorities, and your priorities change. Like, I've got adult kids now, and the way I spend my time with them is really different. So really great question. And I think that whole boundaries thing, and look, I think that leads me into one of this question, because I know this is an amazing thing, and I don't know whether you started you know, when you're on your journey out of prison, but the best version of oneself, you talk about that a lot. I mean, how important are boundaries within you being your best self?
Yeah, crucial. And I just want to sort of tap back into something else that occurred to me around that last question too, that I think relates to this best version of yourself as well. One of the things, and when you were talking, I related to what you were saying there, JK, I really did. But one of the things I've tried to get better at and have boundaries around is who I'm trying to please. You know, I have such a strong desire to be accepted and liked by people. And it's a really natural thing for us as members of a social species, eh? That's how we can get on as communities, collaborate, connect with each other and that. But the problem I've had over the years is I haven't had boundaries around whose acceptance and liking I'm prioritizing. And I think that's a really useful exercise for us to go to as well. Let me give you an example here. Sometimes I will act in ways where I'm prioritizing being liked and being accepted by people who actually don't matter to me at all, and at the expense of my wife and kids. Whereas one of the things that I've gotten better at, and I think this relates to that question from you, Kirsty, is that of going, who are the people who actually most matter to me? And again, this is what I was talking about before, who I least want to let down, and making sure I'm clear about that so that I am prioritizing them. It was just a different way of expressing what I was talking about before, but I think you need to get clear on that. If you are a people pleaser like myself, you want to be really clear at it.
Like, did you write that down? Did you write that down? You know, because no, I'm serious. I'm really intrigued on how you got there, because I think all of us would probably go, right, my family's a priority, but I actually put other things in front of that priority often. So how did you actually organize it in your head to go, well, actually, and then how did you find the boundaries to say, well, they've gone across that boundary? I mean, we've all missed a sports game, right? We've all missed a class meeting or whatever. So how did you actually get to that moment?
Yeah, and look, I think there's actually an exercise that you can do, which is a pretty useful one for people, and I've certainly done it, and I get people to do it as well. And that's where you just grab a Post-it note and you just literally write down whose opinions really matter to me. Who are the people who are most important to me in my life? And the people on that list, it'll be a short list of people, JK. You know, really what they say is if it's more than about 4 or 6, you've probably been too generous. And these are the people who really love you. They accept you for who you are. They want the best for you. Accepting you for who you are, by the way, doesn't mean they don't find you annoying or want you to be less annoying in different ways. But they do love you and accept you for who you are, and they genuinely want the best for you. Hey, those are the people that you want to have on that list. And those are the people you want to be able to refer back to and go, hey, am I doing what matters in terms of prioritizing these people and the time I spend with them and the impact I have on them? And that can be a useful exercise for it. It's certainly one I encourage people to do, and I've done myself. In terms of that question around being the best version of yourself, I mean, for me, that sort of comes into 2 areas. One is the pursuit of your potential in the areas that matter to you. And that's an important clarifier, or qualifier, the areas that matter to you. And being the best is progressing incrementally towards your potential in those areas that matter to you. And the other part of it is being more consistent at demonstrating your values. And those things are not mutually exclusive. So one of the things we talk about in psychology, right, is that every day you encounter these decision points, these forks in the road, where you have the option of moving in the direction that brings you closer towards who you want to be and grow into in your life, or you can move further away from it. And the further away from it is often the emotionally reactive direction, the more gratifying, easier direction. Whereas moving closer towards who you want to be, that's often driven by living your values. And an important thing to think about with your values, of course, is they're aspirational. It's not like your personality and other stuff that just comes easy to you as a default. Your values are what you aspire to live into more consistently and deliberately as you get better at life, as you get older. And so for me, you know, just being able to do that incrementally better tomorrow versus what was being done yesterday, that's what it really needs to be on the path in terms of trying to pursue that best version of yourself. And that pursuing the potential, but I think that shifts at different points of your life. I think when you're younger, it's about destiny in terms of pursuing your potential, in terms of, you know, how you can get as good as possible in the areas you're interested in, the areas that matter. But then you reach a certain age and it becomes about legacy. And it's how can you use the skills and knowledge, the capability you've acquired to have the biggest impact on other people. And for me, it's those 2 areas, right? Living into those values and pursuing that potential.
I'm going to come back to that because I love those 2 things. And I'm pretty complex in there, so I'm going to get back to it. But Vivian's asked a great question, which we've probably all done, Vivian. So sometimes my boundaries shift in favor of forgiveness. It's not black and white, meaning that I will give someone more time to make needed change. However, how much time is too much time to give to someone else to make change in order to keep firm boundaries?
Yeah, and look, I think there's a big difference from boundaries where you completely cut people off versus where you go, hey, I'm going to still be around for this person. I'm just going to accept that they're at this point of their journey, and I'm going to make sure that my values aren't compromised through association with them. And that's where the boundary comes in that type of situation. You know, like I'm in a different world than most people because of my background. So I have to be quite ruthless about not having associations with other people who could contaminate me and my reputation through their current behavior. But if you have loved ones in your life or other people you care about who are in dark places and who have been making bad choices, then sometimes those boundaries aren't about complete cutoff. Sometimes those boundaries are more around, I'm going to make sure that I maintain my integrity and I continue to do what's right, while also being able to accept that you're on your own journey and have expectations of you that are consistent with that. So I don't see those as incompatible at all. And, I think that's great. I think whatever boundaries that you have, particularly around forgiveness and compassion, and that's more a reflection on who you are than who they are. And that's, living in line with those values from my perspective, for most of us anyway, right?
I think that comes back. So, Vivian, the best way I'd put it is I have seen, especially my wife, right? She would look after other people's children when we're in Italy, and they might come into our house with certain values-based and boundaries, but very quickly they knew that my wife had boundaries that were value-based, and they actually had to act accordingly when they came to our house, and they did quite quickly. Now I'm talking about children, so that's a bit of an easy one, but I think that you're prepared to forgive, you should always be very, very proud of, but that forgiveness should not, those people need to know your boundaries, and if it's attached to values, they should know them. You should be really, really clear about them, because forgiveness first must come from, I know you did that and I'm prepared to forgive you, but hey, there's the boundaries. So that's what I try and do if I'm in that space. But getting back to the interesting thing you said, Paul, which intrigued me incredibly when you spoke about values. So I've always seen values as black and white, but you said it's an ideal thing. It's something you're working towards. So it's not a finished product. Could you dig into that, mate? Because I find that really, really intriguing. And then do sometimes you have to give up a little bit to reach your potential if it's not a real, what would I say, a real life and death value? Does that make sense?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think sometimes your values conflict with each other too, right? Like, for example, I might place value on both honesty, but also on compassion. And so there might be some situations where I choose to be compassionate rather than honest, because I think that honesty will unnecessarily hurt someone else in a situation where it isn't the priority compared to helping them feel better than they currently do. And so, look, values regularly conflict. And I mean, look, a classic one that they talk about in philosophy is, again, you have that value of honesty, but then you're hiding a Jewish family in your attic during World War II when the Nazis come to the door. Do you choose to be honest and say, yes, I've got this family in my attic, or do you choose to lie in the interest of protecting their lives? I think our values do often conflict. I think the difficulty is when we don't have a clear sense of what our values are, then it's way easier to go where the emotional currents take us. What's easier in the moment rather than doing the right thing for ourselves. And I think those values conflicts, that's something where you want to be making a conscious decision around what the priority value is here. And let me give you another example of how there's something that you aspire to growing into and demonstrating more, right? So say I have a personal value of ownership. And what that basically means is that I want to always look at what my role was in any situation that transpires, any situation that's suboptimal, in interactions with my wife, with my kids at work or anything. My personal value is to go, hey, what could have I done differently to have had a better outcome? And to take real ownership of my role in things, but also to take ownership in my role in the repair and resolution of things and go, okay, I'm in this situation. It may not have all been on me, but what can I do here to improve things going forward? But I certainly don't always do that, JK. I mean, geez, like anyone who's been in a long-term relationship, sometimes I, feel misunderstood or unappreciated. And to be honest with you, sometimes I pull a mean sulk instead of, actually just taking ownership and going, what was my role? But the journey is about getting better at demonstrating that stuff, not nailing it all the time, but getting better at it and recognizing when we're not. And so for me, that's a lifelong journey. I don't believe that anyone is demonstrating their values all the time in all situations with all people, unless they live a very unusual life where they're not tested at all. in which case they might be living their values or not living them, but experiencing some kind of existential crisis, because I believe meaning comes through embracing the struggle and the challenge, not from sitting on the sidelines.
You said something that's resonated with me, right? Sometimes the emotional currents will take you. Well, I don't quite understand what that means. So you're saying sometimes there's an emotional current that will really challenge your boundaries around your values or where it might be taking you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and let's use another example. Another one of my values is being courageous, doing the right thing regardless of the circumstances. I love that Martin Luther King Jr. quote, which is, it's always the right time to do the right thing. And for me, that requires courage to do that. So courage is something I place value on. But there are situations where, for example, in my personal life, where I lack the courage to share an honest view or opinion with my wife because I fear disappointing her or I fear a conflict. And so for me, that emotion of, just avoiding the conflict, avoiding the disappointment, the worry about that trumps me living my value in some circumstances. So that's what I mean, is it's kind of going, this will be the least challenging emotion, so I'm going to go in this direction. I'm going to let that worry stop me because that seems like it'll be easier than actually doing the right thing here. And that's what I mean by those emotional currents. But also as well, look, hey, sometimes you just react. If you've been under a lot of stress and pressure, right, sometimes there is no actual conscious consideration and you just go into these habitual modes of operation, like me pulling a mean sulk. I'm not always choosing to do that. Sometimes I'm just bloody tired. And so the emotional current of that, it just takes over my thinking mind and I'm just away off having a sulk rather than doing the right thing. So that's what I mean by in terms of those emotional currents.
I think in a lot of these times, and I love what you said about the values, right? Because I'm going to really think about that moving forward because it's an ongoing thing. But I've always thought about, and I think I'm really good at forgiving myself. How did you actually forgive yourself in your past world to actually be where you are today? Because even in our little ways, sometimes when you might be on a big sulk, or I've been angry or whatever, you've got to sort of forgive yourself and then move on, right? Because you made a mistake. So how did you actually start on that journey yourself around? Must have started with forgiveness of yourself, right?
Well, actually, I think that was a real, quite a long-term process, actually. And it was interesting because when Vivian made her comment around forgiveness there, I actually wondered whether she was as good at forgiving herself as she is other people. Because, actually a lot of us find it far easier to be generous with others than with ourselves. And I'm a bit like that. But I think one of the things that I really took on board there is the idea of the difference between guilt and shame and the importance of identifying what emotional experience you're having. Because when we fail to forgive ourselves, it's normally because we feel a sense of shame, which means we think there's something fundamentally wrong with us, something broken that's beyond repair, something enduring that can't be fixed. Whereas actually what I learned to do is, when I'm starting to feel that concern and worry, is to go, actually, this isn't about who I am. This is actually guilt. It's about my behavior, and behavior can change. And the way I learn to forgive myself is through recognizing that everyone makes mistakes, and through making sure that my behavior today reflects the regret I feel for past actions. And so it's through living my life now in a way which reflects that regret and reflects me trying to be who I aspire to grow into. That is the easiest way to forgive myself in that respect. But hey, there are still moments where, I go like, oh my gosh, like the level of impact I've had on people in terms of my actions as a teenager. Like my victim's family, for example, like they're never getting that brother, that son back whose life I ended. There's no shying away from that. But also as well, what I can do is live my life today, and that really reflects who I am and who I want to be. And another interesting one there, JK, is something which we call a trauma-informed approach that helps you overcome that and forgive yourself and others. And basically what the natural thing is to do is when someone does something wrong, or when you do something wrong, is to go to that shame piece. It's to go to that, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with me? What kind of person am I that would do this? Whereas the trauma-informed approach is about going, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you, it's what you've experienced in your life that's led you to this place. And so with that lens on, and habitually, deliberately using that, I'm able to go, hey, look, the mistakes I'm making now aren't because there's something inherently wrong with me, but rather because I've had a life with a certain experiences and certain challenges and certain examples that have meant that this can be a behavior I demonstrate sometimes, but that there is this capacity for growth moving forward. But I have to be directing my energy towards my behavior now and my growth going forward. If I'm expending all my energy on that self-hatred, on that lack of forgiveness, then I'm hemorrhaging this precious limited resource that could be used to actually demonstrate better behavior now. And I'm very conscious of all that stuff. So it's not that I do it perfectly, but I'm good at catching myself when I am beating up on myself and trying to redirect that energy towards my behavior now. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah,
it's a long answer.
No, awesome answer. Thanks, mate. You always inspire me, man. Like, I just love talking to you. So thank you, because your openness and your honesty is just unbelievable, mate. And like I said, you've very quickly affected my life, and you still live with me even when we're not together, because I think about some of these moments. But I just want to talk to you about, because you mentioned it before when you about escape, right? So drugs, alcohol, even when you're in prison, you're still trying to escape. And when I was in my own personal mental hell and I couldn't escape from it, one of the things that I first learned was to switch the old monkey brain off. So how did you take negative escape, drugs and alcohol, and turn it into positive escape? What was that? What were those boundaries? Because I'm pretty sure it's easy to sit here now and talk about it, but I can imagine when you were finishing your first psychology exam, one of your celebration pieces would be, I'm going to get on the drugs or get on the
yeah, look, it's funny. I think there's a couple of things that come to mind for me. One is I just learned to redirect that need into more healthy and positive channels, like exercise. Like when I was in prison, there's very few things you can choose to do in prison, but you can exercise. And I used to exercise twice a day, and that would help provide me with a really positive outlet. And all of the stuff that I was seeking through alcohol and drug use, all of that dopamine, all of those feel-good neurotransmitters going on, I learned to seek that and get that from other areas that actually over time would be far more effective and far more useful in terms of, the feel-good that I was looking for, escaping from some of those challenges. But here's a really interesting one as well that's part of that journey, and which is an important one for people to be aware of today, and that's this. It's that sometimes the challenge is you don't feel like doing those things that would be good for you. It's hard to motivate to do it, right? Like the exercise and the rest of it. And this is particularly relevant for people who are in quite high pressure, high demanding roles. And there's some good research around this in terms of boundaries. It originally comes out from law enforcement, from first responders in the US, where you've got people who have high intensity jobs where they encounter a lot of stress. And what it talks about is most people's lives inhabit sort of like levels of stress and dopamine. And dopamine's about mood and motivation, right? It's about feeling good, feeling purposeful, feeling engaged, and having the motivation to do stuff that matters to you, do stuff that's good for you. And most people operate between these lines in terms of adrenaline and dopamine release. They get a peak up here where they feel really energized and really good and really positive and really focused. And then they get a dip, which is the same as the level up. You get the down, and that's where you feel less energized, less purposeful. You just want to withdraw a bit. You're a bit But what happens is some people are in these jobs where they have way bigger spikes, where they have way more intense periods of focus and purpose and energy and having to get stuff done. But the problem is then they have bigger dips. And guess where those bigger dips occur, JK? They occur at home, right? And then what happens is over time, people start to lose any boundaries between work and home, because what they do is they go, when I'm at home, I feel pretty shit. I feel low energy. I feel low purpose. I don't feel great. But when I'm at work, I feel much better. So what I'll do is I'll start spending more time at work. I'll start checking my phone more often at different parts of the night and the day and on the weekends, because that's where I get this little boost of potential purpose and energy. And one of the things they've found is if you keep doing that, you know, you end up with these workaholic tendencies. You end up deprioritizing the people in your life who actually matter most to your life satisfaction over time. And one of the things they've discovered is the importance of having really clear boundaries, where what you do is you make sure you engage in these activities that are good for you, even though you don't feel the initial motivation to do them. And you'll relate to this from depression, right? Where you just don't feel like doing things that previously you were interested in, you know, you enjoy when you do them. And in terms of the boundaries they talk about here, it's forcing yourself to commit to go, I will spend time with my kids. I will go and do that exercise, even though I know I won't feel like doing it. I will spend time away from my phone. I will do these other things, even though you don't feel like doing it. Because when you do it, you do tend to get the boost from it, but it's overcoming that initial hurdle of lower dopamine to get you motivated to actually make the start. And so that was one of the things that I got much better at in prison. And to be honest with you, in some respects, it was easier, because the further away you move from alcohol and drug use, the easier it is to maintain being alcohol and drug free. And in prison, you have so few options that it was easier anyway to build a really strong habit of exercise and yoga and some of those other things that actually help equip you to deal with those challenges. Whereas, you know, when you're out here in normal life, you know, you've got to do your own laundry, cook your own meals, travel, work, all of that other stuff. So in some respects, ironically, it was actually a little bit easier, JK.
That's interesting, eh? Thanks very much, Vivian. It's good to see you. You've told us you're self-compassionate.
Yeah, wicked, Vivian.
Yeah, thank you. And compassion is part of my practice. Hardest part is how others may not appreciate the forgiveness I've imparted when they consider those that have been forgiven to be not deserved. And I understand that. I think and this might not have a lot to do with it, but someone said to me once, I was coaching, you know, and someone said to me, well, coaching's a little bit like loving your kids, mate. You need to give as much as you can and expect nothing in return.
Nice.
And I always thought that was quite interesting, because I think, you know, when you talk about, you know, that side of your life, and I think it comes back to some of the boundaries you set for yourself and some of the rules you need to make. You know, for me, like I said before, I'm prepared to give trust and be disappointed, and I'm often disappointed. But I've made that decision, and I just keep coming back to me. But healthy boundaries, unhealthy boundaries, mate. How do you understand those? You just talked about one of those work ones, and I'm thinking about myself. Shit, am I doing some of that? Because I'm really inspired and working pretty hard at the moment. How do you know when it's one of those borderline unhealthy boundaries, but might feel like a healthy one?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I suppose for me, you know, one of the things I've learned to do more and more is really lean on my wife, to be honest, in terms of getting a stare and getting some feedback there. And I'm very lucky, you know, that my wife is really committed to us and to our marriage, and is really committed as well to making sure that she gives me feedback if she starts to notice any creep, any deprioritization. But also I have a real reflective practice, JK, where every day, you know, like I journal and I reflect on what's come up over the last 24 hours. What have I learned? What have I gotten? And it's like I said before about your values being aspirational. Geez, I'm still a bloody work in progress, no doubt about it. But what I do is I stop and pause and reflect. And I think about lessons learned that I can incorporate going forward, rather than just proceeding through life. And that helps me, you know, really refine those boundaries, but also continue to sort of like manage them effectively. And I do want, people to get that is that I think boundaries are dynamic and they do shift and change according to who you're dealing with, time of life, what's going on. I mean, for me, it brings to mind the whole concept of like work-life balance. Often people think this is some static thing that you just achieve and then you're like in this Zen post, right? And the universe, it flows through you and it's just completely static. Whereas, I remember hearing from a mate of mine, Digby, he talks about work-life balance being more like, you've got a barrel on its side and a plank on it, and you're standing on that and you're constantly having to shift your weight to maintain your balance. It's super dynamic. And I think boundaries can be a little bit like that too. I think life changes, life evolves, and your boundaries have to be a bit dynamic and a bit adaptive on that basis too. So you do have to keep monitoring them. How are they working? This worked for me previously. Is it now isolating me? Hey, this worked for me previously. Is it no longer working in some way? Do I need something else going on here? And I think that's an important idea.
Yeah, Trish says, sounds like you have a great, strong lady supporting you and standing beside you, mate. So I know that'd be the truth. Yeah, I reckon that's a really interesting thing. So I'm going to say one thing, communication, right? Sometimes we leave it in our head. And my daughter said to me yesterday, actually, Dad, you're working really hard at the moment. And one of the things that I'd forgotten to tell her is how inspired I am at the moment and how I'm actually loving my work. And also, I said to her, she's getting married in June, I said, and I don't mind working every day at the moment because I'm going to have a month with you in Italy. So I think those things are really important. Often with these things, we think they're black and white. And I always talk about leadership being grey, because if it was black and white, everyone would be doing it. But leading yourself, often it's grey, isn't it? Often the answers aren't there and you've got to try, and those boundaries can go backwards and forwards a bit.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And it's like with the work piece, I love that because I'm the same. There will be periods where I am super busy in terms of delivery, but that will be so that I can have other periods where I can create even more quality time with the people who matter most to me. The difficulty is where you're just being swept away by what's going on and you're not actually consciously making the decisions around this stuff, and you're not prioritizing the stuff that matters. That's from my perspective anyway.
Out of your incredibly rich life, what is your most important boundary?
Oh, I would say my most important boundary is commitment in my marriage. I think that's it. And also as well with my kids. So it's kind of like, for me, that's sort of like a package deal. So my family piece, that's my most important boundary. That I do things that are in the interest of my kids being able to grow up and have the most functional, lives possible, where they're equipped to deal with the challenges they'll encounter in a way that really matters. And then spreading out from that, I think that's actually a boundary which just goes out like ripples, where it's just about making sure that I'm having a positive impact and meeting my obligations in terms of the people who matter most to me and the people I interact with. So it's not really answered your question, but sort of, if that makes sense.
Mate, that was awesome, mate. Unbelievable. So just finally, what would be your most important messages to others about healthy boundaries?
Yeah, look, I think that they need to be something that you stop and think about. I don't think they're necessarily something that you automatically have. I also think that they need to be something that you experiment with rather than imagine and then get disappointed, that when they don't work, because again, it's sort of trial and error there. But also as well, in terms of those boundaries around who you associate with, again, history is not destiny. Just because you have historical relationships with people and you've operated a certain way doesn't mean you need to carry on that path. One of the great things about being a person is we get to choose every moment of the day what we want our future to be. And that's all on us in terms of how we choose to respond to the circumstances we're in. So, you can recreate those boundaries at any time. You can institute new boundaries and you can abandon ones that no longer work or never did.
So awesome. Like, for me, mate, you've inspired me once again. Like I said to you at the top, love working with. If you people want to find out more about Dr. Paul Wood, go to paulwood.com. Definitely check out Dr. Paul's 2 awesome published books, How to Escape from Prison, really affected my life, and Mental Fitness, which is probably, the way that you got through it, and some of the things that you've been talking about today, he'll inspire you, mate. Just personally, I just think you're amazing. Like I said, thank you once again for your time. You're always generous with it. And I've gone away learning a whole lot of stuff. So thank you, my friend. Have an amazing weekend. And I'm looking forward to catching up. And I heard your new book. So I'll look forward.
Awesome. Brilliant, JK. Hey, the feeling is mutual, brother. And thanks so much to all of you who tuned in. I know you have other things you could be doing with your time. Super appreciate it. Aroha nui, big love, big respect.
Ka kite.